Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Muriel and in this video I'm going to talk about my experience with autism spectrum disorder. Last week I uploaded a video in which I talked about my experience with and partial knowledge of mental illness and psychiatry. I touched a little bit upon the fact I am autistic in that video, that being autistic intersects with my experience of mental illness, and that I would go more in depth with the autism stuff in another video. This is that video. And a friendly FYI that this is going to be a long video, so chapters, I think they're called now, are your friends here. Here again, I'm going to start with a rundown of my life history as it pertains to me being autistic all along. I've always felt different. This graduated to feeling like a massive alien as I went through puberty, but this feeling of not quite fitting in with everyone else, of being on the boundary of things, if you will, has been with me since I was very young. From what my mother has told me, I was very content being on my own as a baby and toddler, and I was apparently exceptionally calm and quiet, i.e. I never ever cried for anything, which apparently is unusual for babies. I was also intellectually precocious, not an autistic characteristic in and of itself, but I am also twice exceptional, so that's why I'm mentioning it. The two are tied together in my lived experience. If you've ever heard of little professor syndrome, that was me, basically. I was the encyclopedia on legs in primary school, the smarty pants and nerd that got picked on and bullied anytime I was with more than one other child. I always felt awkward around others. Can't tell you exactly how or what I did wrong, but I remember the feeling distinctly, that I always felt off in a group, even if I wasn't actively being bullied in each situation. At times I said things that were wrong or said at the wrong time, and after a while I realized I preferred being on my own most of the time anyway. That, or I latched on very strongly to one specific friend, but more on that in a bit. As I said in my previous video, nothing majorly disruptive ever happened when I was in primary school. I was top of my class, I did socialize to a certain extent, I did have some friends, so my parents never had any reason to suspect I might be autistic or even more broadly mentally ill until the end of my primary schooling, right before I hit puberty. It was also the late 90s in all fairness, and autism in girls just wasn't a thing. That being said, one thing did happen when I was 4 or 5 years old. My parents had organized an Easter egg hunt in our apartment, and because of this, kids had gone into my bedroom to look for chocolate eggs. They touched my stuff, moved it around, and I had a massive meltdown. Indeed, I've always been very particular about my private space, my things, and I don't like people touching or moving any of it. But more on my OCD-like traits in a bit as well. In any case, my mother did find that reaction a bit strange and extreme at the time, but she didn't make any more of it ultimately. By the end of primary school, I had become a true loner without any friends at all, and staunchly preferred the company of books and animals to that of people. I was very close to my mother, still am today. She was my primary person, and I didn't trust anyone else could be that for me when I started secondary school, when it all went to shite. Puberty happened, so kids around me, girls especially from what I could tell, were starting to become interested in dating, sort of, and other kinds of stereotypically gendered stuff, shall we say. There was a strong interest in clothing and fashion going around among them, even the boys to a lesser extent because of mild classism, and I was the weird girl who sat alone at recess and either read or drew dragons in her notebook. I was bullied once again, developed school phobia, and went to the children's hospital. There I also had a hard time socializing with my peers, and some of the nurses also gave me a hard time because I didn't have any interest in stereotypically girly things. I was given a diagnosis of psychotic personality structure, which is interesting given autism used to be classified as infantile psychosis, and one of the reasons, I kid you not because this is written verbatim in the hospitalization report I have in my files, was that I was too obsessed with dragons and fantasy literature. So hark, fellow nerds, if you like SFF, psychoanalysis says your personality is psychotic. I was also given an IQ test, which confirmed I was intellectually gifted, but the staff hid this from my parents, which I'm pretty sure is illegal, but whatever. The Children's Hospital Psych Unit might have been well-intentioned, sure, but they also clearly had a normalizing imperative given the way my differences were handled and outright pathologized. And as a rule, to be honest, mainstream psychiatric clinics are not well adapted to neurodivergent patients at all. Is anyone really surprised? Things were a little bit better at the children's hospital school because classes were smaller and the teachers were on more familiar terms with their students. As someone who got along better with adults than she did with her same-aged peers, this was a much better situation for me than regular schooling. Of course, it also made me extra vulnerable to abuse, which is exactly what happened as I was groomed and raped and abused by Guy, the science and maths teacher. The rest of my secondary schooling went relatively smoothly, though like I said previously, I experienced recurring depression, anxiety, loneliness, etc. Socially, things were better than they had been in primary school in that I wasn't bullied and more or less got along with everyone without ever getting close to anyone or making any real friends. I was the loner nerd, mildly exotic because of my Anglo-Saxon heritage, and probably seen as asexual to a large extent, though I was a smidge provocative at times with a couple of the boys in my science class without entirely meaning to be. And because of the whole abusive relationship with my rapist thing, I also thought of myself as a kind of bad girl. Stupid, I know. The point is I didn't fit in anywhere. I couldn't be pegged into any preset box, and thus functioned as a social nomad. No one really bothered too much. Plus, you know, I spent all my free time reading or doing my homework in advance in the library. The big change or transition from primary to secondary school was disastrous, so was the other big transition from secondary school to university, where I never made any friends at all. I never participated in university extracurricular activities, and honestly don't see how I could have and maintained my hobbies and my studies at the same time. Not enough spoons for all that shit when you're an autistic introvert. Group labs and group projects were a nightmare for me, oral exams pure torture. I couldn't really establish rapport with professors like I had with teachers in secondary school, and overall, I just struggled severely with the rhythms of higher education. I attended a day clinic between 2015 and 2016, and there again I struggled to do precisely what I'd been sent there to do: socialize. The cultural divide present between myself and most of the other patients also didn't help. By cultural divide, I mean that I align a lot more with the Anglo-Saxon side of my familial and cultural heritage, rather than the Francophone one, and living in Francophone Belgium means I've mostly encountered pure Belgians whenever I've gone to school or a medical institution. And yes, this has always been difficult for me, even though I am also technically Belgian and have always lived here. The intersection of heritage and personal affinities be complicated like that. Same pretty much went when my drawing class was concerned, and the music theory lessons I took in 2019 and 2020 until everything shut down because of COVID were even worse because I had to sing in class and take an oral singing exam during which I almost fainted from stress. My stay at the hospital between 2020 and 2021 was also particularly difficult because it was a sensory nightmare. I was surrounded by people when I pretty much lost all the social skills I'd managed to gain despite everything over the years, as well as my psychic armor, and I had to share my room with another patient and changed roommates 6 times, which was also an adaptational nightmare. I was on the autism track by that point, but tried hard to convince myself it couldn't apply to me, and that I could never find a way to get assessed anyhow. Indeed, I started thinking about autism as a possibility for myself about 18 to 24 months before I received my diagnosis. I'll be honest here, I originally had a very limited and stereotypical understanding of what autism, and Asperger's as it was known then, was. Then when I became active on Reddit, of all places, I encountered quite a lot of neurodivergent people and decided to investigate what the hell it was all about. I took online tests, read articles, and watched videos written and made by autistic women, and twice exceptional autistic women more specifically, and a lot of what they talked about strongly resonated with me. I also, anecdotally scored highly on the AQ test, the RAADS test, and the ASPE quiz. I was also part of a Discord server which had an overrepresentation of neurodivergent folks, and it has so far been the only group setting I've ever felt somewhat comfortable in. Could I be autistic? I started asking myself. I know self-diagnosis is a thing, and I think it can be valid if the person self-diagnosing has done their research, but I have imposter syndrome, and I can never feel comfortable self-diagnosing with something as complex as ASD, especially given my complicated psychiatric history. So like I said, I tried to convince myself I wasn't autistic, and tried to forget about it. Until 2020, when I had my big breakdown. I hoped the new psychiatrist I saw at the time would refer me for a diagnostic service, but instead he sent me to get my IQ tested. I kept my suspicions about autism to myself, fearing I would be made fun of given all that I heard and read about late diagnosed autistic women and their experiences with the medical system and society at large. I did bring it up when I was at the hospital in 2021, but whilst the staff didn't make fun of me, they told me they didn't have any competence in this domain and couldn't help me further. Then, in early summer of 2021, my therapist at the time brought the subject of autism up and said that she, the psychiatrist who'd sent me to her for therapy, and the psychiatrist who'd overseen the group therapy I tried the previous autumn for social anxiety disorder, all suspected I might be autistic. I was dumbstruck, and a bit miffed she hadn't said anything sooner, when I'd had autism scratching on the back door of my mind and concerns for more than a year. But in any case, she sent me to a colleague of hers who had experience treating ASD patients for a pre-screening of sorts, and this therapist told me that my profile and history, in her professional opinion, matched those of many of her female patients, and that I should pursue a diagnostic assessment. Here's the catch though. French-speaking Belgium is absolute shite at helping autistic adults get a diagnosis and follow-up care. By shite, I mean that there is only one pluridisciplinary center who does diagnostic assessments in adults, and it has a waiting list of, wait for it, 16 years. Or it did, because it has now closed. That being said, one is opening in Brussels at the end of this year, but still, one isn't enough, and just getting a diagnosis isn't enough for a lot of us who also suffer from comorbid psychiatric conditions. The message one gets as an autistic adult in French-speaking Belgium is that once we hit 18, we don't matter. It's not a nice feeling, and the situation isn't much better in France either. But again, I could rant about this for hours, and no one wants that. I couldn't go the route of pursuing an assessment at a hospital or center, but citizens are free to pay for private assessments from their own pockets. So I did with the help of my parents. I found a qualified neuropsychologist who assessed my history, traits, functioning over several sessions using filmed standardized interview methods and tests such as the ADOS-2, the ADR, and a sensory profile questionnaire. I also sent her, class photos, wrote up long emails full of everything I could think of that might be relevant to her analysis, and usually assessments include an IQ test as well, but I'd already had that done a year prior. Doing that kind of neuropsychological assessment forces you to crank introspective mode up 1000%. It is draining and potentially painful if your history includes comorbid depression, anxiety, and traumatic events. It is worth it, yes, but keep that in mind if you're in the process of preparing for it. The analysis and test results came back clearly positive for ASD, and all I had left to do was get the diagnosis signed off by a psychiatrist, which also required a bit of shopping around, but which I finally got done at the end of 2021. Unfortunately, like I said, getting the diagnosis is only the beginning, and there are very few resources available for non-intellectually disabled or high-functioning, a misnomer, but whatever, autistic adults where I live. Finding a therapist or organism who knows this shit is a struggle, and one needs to resort to non-profit orgs or things like Facebook groups to get any kind of broader support. Before I get into my autistic traits, I just want to add a few words about intellectual giftedness. First, what the hell is it? Very simply put, intellectual giftedness in the research literature is defined as possessing an IQ that is equal or superior to a score of 130 on the Wechsler scale, or more broadly, an IQ score that is 2 standard deviations above average. I am aware a lot of peeps nowadays like to say IQ is bullshit, it's eugenesis, blah blah blah, but I disagree. IQ is actually one of the most studied and statistically verified psychometric measures out there, so I think it is valid. However, it is equally valid to question whether it accurately measures the entirety of a person's intelligence, because it clearly doesn't. But as a general measure or starting point, I think it's fine. And I do think some critiques stem from a broader societal devaluation and malintentioned jealousy of intelligence in a way that other qualities such as physical beauty, strength, or say, I don't know, sense of humor don't garner, but that's another debate for another day. However, it is a fact. Intelligence is also very often discriminated against in school settings by same-aged peers. I speak from experience. But there is a big problem with the concept of intellectual giftedness, specifically in francophone countries where it has become a pseudoscientific diagnosis, mixing autistic and ADHD traits with the fact of having a high IQ. As a result, high intelligence is pathologized when all longitudinal studies to date have shown a correlation between high intelligence, health, happiness, and success in life, and it is conflated with neurodivergence. The results of this are twofold. 1. High IQ people such as myself, who get sent down the path of intellectual giftedness, or high potential as it is known here, and struggle in life, feel extra shitty because according to the research, our big brains should make us thrive. And two, it is used to explain away our difficulties by some exploitative shrinks, leading us to potentially miss out on useful and life-changing neurodivergent diagnoses and the specialized care they often require. I went down this rabbit hole after I received my IQ score and became extremely angry and frustrated because I realized it didn't fucking explain anything really, whereas the autism does. So to be clear, high intelligence does not, according to most research, come with specific psychometric characteristics or personality traits. That being said, I have to admit that the autistic testimonials I related to the most came from twice exceptional women specifically, and it seems from a purely anecdotal perspective that high IQ might give an additional flavoring to one's autism in a way I can't actually define, only feel. So obviously, take this with a massive pinch of salt. In any case, intellectual giftedness doesn't make me a better or a worse person than anyone else, and given my numerous failures at life so far, I really don't feel gifted most of the time anyway. Clinical definitions of autism include having difficulties with social interactions and social communication, rigid thinking, clinging to routines, engaging in special interests, and displaying stereotypical/repetitive behaviors, and increasingly issues with sensory processing. Struggling with social stuff is probably the most obvious autistic trait I originally identified and talked about. I mean, I used to joke I was socially disabled years before I knew I was autistic, and I was right, without knowing it. I had, after all, a diagnosis of social anxiety disorder for most of my life, but traditional treatments for it never worked, precisely because it stems from experiencing the world as an autistic person. I don't relate closely to other people easily, even in fiction. I've always said I'm not primarily a character-driven reader. Well, ASD might be partly responsible. I don't make friends easily at all either. Meeting new people stresses me out, something also linked to a need for routines and resistance to change, and I am garbage at small talk. Like, I'll avoid taking the elevator in my building just so I don't have to stand awkwardly with a neighbor in it. I can't just bond with someone situationally or through one single hobby, for example, which I've been told is natural for most people, but I'll get back to relationships and attachment per se later. I'm not entirely sure I'm good or bad at reading body language, probably a bit of both. And besides, I might have simply learned to interpret it over the years, like a lot of late diagnosed, higher functioning autistics. In that case, it is done through intellectual means and not instinctual ones, which is apparently how most people do it. I don't make eye contact when I speak to someone. I know that is a pretty big stereotype, unless it's my mother or a partner, and even then there are times when this is difficult. And my ex David, who I think is on the spectrum as well, was the same. And I thought this was normal until I started reading about autism. I was like, wait, what? You're supposed to look everyone in the eye when you speak to them? The fuck? To me, eye contact is extremely intense and intimate, and the idea of doing it with like doctors, acquaintances, and shit grosses/stresses me out. Like many autistics, I can't focus on what I'm being told if I have to force myself to look someone in the eyes at the same time. I struggle with implicit content and can easily take things too literally. There's a thing in French called second degree, so second degré, which basically means saying something that is ironic or sarcastic and actually meaning something else. Not a perfect explanation, but there is no direct translation for that concept. This I remember clearly struggling with in childhood. I was the kind of kid who would reply to her bullies, "I can't be fat like a whale because whales aren't fat. They're the right weight for their environment." Or, "A bird's appetite actually means being a porker because birds eat a crap ton to support the ability to fly." This kind of thing had the side effect of making me appear the pedantic asshole, so you can imagine that didn't help with my social situation in primary school. If I hear a metaphorical expression I don't know, I will always picture it literally in my mind and try to reverse engineer the meaning out from the images used. This obviously doesn't always work, like with the expression, "It's raining cats and dogs." I know what it means, but it is entirely nonsensical to me and bugs me a little as a result. I don't know, like, where did that come from? Why? Whereas wearing your heart on your sleeves, whilst also weird at face value, taking an organ out and putting it on your sleeve, does convey the idea that you are making yourself vulnerable, which corresponds to its actual meaning, so that makes more sense to me. I can also struggle with modulating the tone or volume of my voice appropriately in conversation, and the way I engage verbally can be pretty black and white, in the sense that I'll go long periods without talking, just observing and listening. I'm a very good listener. But then talk my ass off once I'm engaged in a subject I'm knowledgeable and or passionate about. I've been told I start talking very quickly and sometimes too loudly and can appear arrogant or pedantic without meaning to. Added to the fact I am female, this perceived arrogance has very often been levied against me in sometimes very cruel ways, I might add. I found this piece of testimony from an autistic person that really captures some of the issues I've had with this. Quote, I have a hard time selecting listener-appropriate vocabulary. I often fail and appear arrogant because I hate being treated like I am stupid, ignorant, or dumb by having people talk down to me, and so it is my autistic way of showing respect by not talking down to others. But it's also true I don't suffer fools lightly, and whilst I strive to be kind and patient and understanding, when I'm engaged in debate or serious conversation, I expect a certain level of intellectual rigor, good faith, etc. Add to that a need for exactitude and truth with a capital T, and you can end up having very upsetting philosophical discussions because you're just so passionate about what you're talking about, so desperate to convey your meaning to the other party, that it can become a highly emotional situation, provoking tears, even as you're trying to keep it firmly grounded in the intellectual/rational. And this most recently caused issues in my relationship with my ex David, for example, because he is the exact same way, so at times sparks flew. Truth also matters in that I find it very difficult to be deceptive, and I'm honestly not a good liar unless I really apply myself, but I don't like lying at all. In fact, I value transparency and honesty to an extremely high degree and cannot stand lying or hypocrisy or, gaslighting. For more context on that, see my previous reading wrap-up. This can in turn make it difficult for me to gauge accurately when I'm oversharing or not as well. As a result, I've sort of developed two extremes of functioning. I either say nothing or want to share all of myself as truthfully as possible. It can even be a struggle here on this channel, actually, when I'm not always certain if what I say or share is TMI or not. Finally, the empathy question. Yes, autistic people can and do feel empathy and compassion. I certainly do. But it's very selective and bimodal, once again. At times I feel too much empathy, if that makes sense, and at others I don't really feel much when most other people would, I guess. Now, in the literature, there's this thing about distinguishing between emotional and cognitive empathy, but honestly, I'm not really sure how to understand it. Autistic people are supposed to be good at the first but bad at the second, but when I looked at the definition of each, I felt I was better at the latter. There's certainly an important degree of intellectualization when it comes to empathy and compassion for me, yes. Perhaps some of it is precisely overcompensation, which can then, ironically, perhaps make one more empathetic than the average person. And I do think I'm good at understanding different points of view and being fairly diplomatic, but, most of that is very rational and not so much emotional, I guess, though I'm not a big fan of a very rigid divide between the two. Though, like I said, I can also feel too much empathy because I just tend to feel things very intensely. I function better in most contexts with routines and habits. I score very highly in openness on the Ocean psychometric scale, for reference, so clinging to routines doesn't mean one can't also enjoy a wide variety of ideas and exploring things intellectually or artistically. My special interests or reading interests are proof of that. But when it comes to day-to-day life, I am not at all adventurous. I like for my days to look the same, and I don't deal well with change or big life transitions, my negative experiences with schooling being a prime example. It can also make things like loss and grief even more difficult to deal with, because it implies a very emotionally charged change and often changes your daily life and schedule. For example, I had gotten used to speaking for 2 or 3 hours a day with David about everything as a best friend and loving partner, and when he broke up with me in particularly negative circumstances, not only did I lose him, I lost the changes I'd made to my life and habits because of him. And, obviously this can also intersect with abuse abuse in that it can make leaving an abusive situation even harder than it would otherwise be for a neurotypical victim. I like to do things the same way, and my own way, of course. I like to cling to established patterns because they are reassuring and also save me a measure of cognitive load, I assume, which matters because my cognitive processes tend to be fatigued by being so bloody active all the time and by dealing with wonky sensory and emotional processing. This then ties into what I'll call my OCD-like or OCD-adjacent traits. I fully believe that had a psychiatrist ever known fully about some of my peculiarities in this domain, I would have received a diagnosis of OCD, but I believe it all basically stems from an autistic cognitive profile. I love order, neatness, and keeping things in their right place. I put my clothes and my books away in a specific way, and doing it any other way stresses me out. I use a ruler to align my books and to place the few decorative objects I have properly. I love to sort things and place things properly after I've cleaned or reorganized my room, for example. Unfortunately, this also ties into perfectionism, which I suffer from as well. I mean, being a perfectionist has its perks in that it makes you pay attention to detail and produce high-quality work or artistic creations, but in my experience, it's more unhealthy than anything else because it's very hard to keep it in check. Like, I used to have mini meltdowns because I felt my handwriting wasn't clean enough in my diaries, so I would rip the page out and start over from scratch. At school, this made me a very, very slow note taker, and even though I was a very good student, this got called out by a few teachers who told me I really had to make an effort to write things down faster, but I couldn't. I also get easily stressed out by getting stuck on thought loops, which prevent me from concluding, sorting, or reorganizing activities, and then have to resort to a weird mental visualization exercise I came up with involving a grid of 3x3 exclamation marks to make it stop. Like I said, OCD-like traits. Stimming stands for self-stimulatory behavior and is done by almost all autistic people, though it is also done by some allistic or non-autistic people. From a cursory search, stimming is done in response to anxiety, heightened emotional states, overstimulation or understimulation perhaps. It's also kind of a cousin behavior to fidgeting, which is very common in people with ADHD, but if you want to learn more, here's a video that talks about this in more detail. I definitely stim and fidget at times as well. I'm not entirely sure why I do it though. I both do it when I am stressed and when I am not stressed but doing stuff, so being active, I guess. I want to say I do it even when I'm calm and not doing anything physically active like reading, but then maybe I am actually being highly stimulated intellectually and it has to come out through stimming somehow. I can not stim or fidget at all and be very, very still, but then I usually dissociate at those times too, so not sure what my takeaway or yours should be here. Stimming can come in many shapes and sizes. Hand flapping, that's a big stereotype. Rocking is another, but also twirling your hair, chewing your lips, touching a specific texture, or even doodling, I've learned, can all be forms of stimming. In my case, I can identify leg jiggling as a form of fidgeting when I'm bored or impatient, or doing things like clicking repetitively a ballpoint pen. When it comes to stimming, however, I've identified several behaviors. The most common forms of stimming I do include doing this. So, raking my nails against one another until they are pitted or frayed, and I have to cut them very short again because I hate having long nails. More generally, I fiddle about with my fingers a lot. I pull on them, I crack my knuckles a lot. I also do this and chew easily on the insides of my mouth, sometimes to the point of mild injury, and same goes with my fingers, which is kind of silly, I know, but not that big of a deal. I also do this. So basically I fiddle with my ears, I fold them in on themselves, I twist them, etc. Fun fact, I was told off for doing this by a girl in my class when I was 16 years old. I hadn't even noticed I was doing it because a lot of the times we just start stimming without realizing, but she said, "Ew, what are you doing? Stop doing that." And I felt terribly ashamed for a hot minute, even though, you know what, I wasn't doing anything wrong, and what did it matter to her? But, you know, whatever. I also count doodling as a form of stimming in my case, and I did this a lot in school during classes I didn't like, and still do it often when I'm on the phone, because being on the phone stresses me out, and I struggle at times to stay focused on conversation. As an aside, David did this as a regular stim. And when we were together, we kind of stimmed a little bit with each other's bodies, which was a really nice thing, actually. It furthered our intimacy, contributed to the way we showed one another physical affection, and it was very relaxing. And David told me he'd read it was quite a common thing for neurodivergent couples to do together. A lot of people, regardless of neurotype, obviously have specific areas of interest, a specific passion or hobby. But it gets cranked up with autistic and other neurodivergent folks. We become experts or amateur experts in our special interests and have a very strong need to indulge in them, sometimes to the point of not taking care of ourselves. For example, reading about a subject for hours on a computer and forgetting to eat, drink, and go to sleep. That kind of level of obsession. In fact, it's precisely this kind of behavior that can make getting misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder more likely. Though as a reminder, you can be autistic and suffer from bipolar, that's a thing too. Some special interests stay for life, some come and go. Some autistic people have fewer special interests, some have more. Autism is, after all, a spectrum condition, and its traits largely move around on spectra of their own as well. Several of the special interests I have had since childhood, and a lot of them are related to one another. I kind of picture it as a web of special interests, if you will, centered on nodes or primary special interests. These nodes include mythology/folklore and fantastical beasts, dinosaurs/burbs, well, burbs are dinosaurs, so that's that, and nature more broadly, and speculative literature/imaginary worlds. As I grew up, feminism became another primary special interest, as did pagan spirituality with the occult, and human sexuality through art and culture specifically, though I'm also interested in the biopsychological aspects of it, obviously. When I was a child, I also had my Pokemon phase, big Pokemon phase, which you can link back to the fantastical creature and mythology special interest, and my Harry Potter phase, which you can link back to that same primary special interest and that of imaginary literary worlds. Through puberty, I went through an intense, and I mean intense, dragon phase, which you can also link back to dinosaurs, fantastical creatures, and imaginary worlds. My interest in feminism has also been tied into my interest in non-Abrahamic spirituality and religions, and into my interest in human sexuality. My interest in paganism and the occult is also clearly rooted in my earlier special interest in mythology, folklore, and non-ordinary reality, to put it in broader terms, as well as my primary special interest in nature and animals. My interest in science and biology, more specifically, naturally grew out of the latter as well. And psychedelics, a more recent special interest of mine, definitely grew out of the primary special interests of nature, science, the imaginary, and spirituality, and a desire, to treat mental illness. I also had a very strong A Song of Ice and Fire phase, during which I spent hours upon hours watching and reading about theories and world building. I say phase for it, and I did too when it comes to dragons. But to be clear, I am still interested and attached to those things. They're phases more in the sense that I'm less actively engaged in those special interests today through reading about them or creating things involving them. But the word worm with a Y is in the very name of my channel, so that should tell you how much I still love dragons, for instance. Another special interest I developed more recently involves the debate/conflict between gender identity ideology and gender critical feminism, which obviously ties back to my interest in feminism. Though here again I must add a caveat in that feminism is more than just an interest, since I do consider myself feminist, and it's not just, an abstract subject, but something which involves justice, fairness, and the ways we live in the world. The same applies to a certain extent to non-Abrahamic faiths, because I don't just study it as a purely intellectual exercise, it also aligns in some respects with the ways I experience faith. Then again, special interests will often involve emotions and attachment and very personal things, because that's just how the human psyche works, and the autistic psyche specifically can also get intense when it comes to emotions, but more on that in a bit. Each autistic person will have a unique sensory profile involving hypo and or hypersensitivities. All my external senses are basically hypersensitive. I am very sensitive to light and movement. I'm always the first one to notice something out of the corner of my eye, which does make me a good observer of nature, on the one hand, but it also means I have to keep my curtains mostly drawn all day on the other. Also, bright sunlight makes my depression much worse. Counterintuitive, I know, but true story. I am I'm very sensitive to smell. I will always be the first one to go, do you smell that? Taste-wise, yeah, I'm sensitive to taste too, but not necessarily the best at discriminating between similar tastes. Like, alcohol just tastes like alcohol to me. Okay, I can tell whiskey tastes different from wine, right? For example, but mostly booze just tastes like repulsive ethanol to me, and that's that. Same goes with seafood. To me, it all tastes like, well, seafood, and I don't like that. If it comes out of the water, I will not eat it. I also find some vegetables like broccoli or cooked spinach have this overwhelmingly green taste that I don't like either. So yes, like a lot of autistic people, I was a picky eater as a child. And while I eat a lot more diversely than I did then, thankfully, I still eat a lot less diversely than my parents, for example, or other members of my family. I am very sensitive to touch. I've always cut the tags off my clothes, for example, and was shocked to learn that's a typically neurodivergent thing, when I just thought, doesn't everyone do that? I am particular about certain textures too. Cotton wool, velvet, and velveteen are cursed materials, for example, that I'd rather not touch if I can avoid it. Personal touch I consider very intimate, so I'd rather not touch anyone I don't know or even don't love, or, feel some attachment for at the very least. I think asking someone before hugging them is a highly civilized practice, and the Latin bees can go fuck itself. That's one thing I'm glad COVID kicked to the curb. To my Anglo-Saxon friends who don't have to suffer through this, if you don't know what this is, bees is basically when you meet someone, even just casual acquaintances and friends, you have to go, I hate it. If I love you, however, then prepare for a lot of physical affection because ironically enough, touch is one of, if not my primary love language. I've also noticed that, as for a lot of other autistic people, pressure can be extremely relaxing. I prefer a massage that involves more pressure than less, for example, and when I was with David and had an anxiety attack, he squeezed me in a very, very tight hug, almost to the point of obstructing my breathing, and thus forced me to slow my breathing down. It was incredible, and I can add that to the list of things I've lost with him. Then we have sound. My extra sharp hearing is a fucking meme at this point in my household. That's how sensitive it is. I also have a musical ear and a gift for music, and suffer from earworms all the bloody time. If you don't know what an earworm is, it's getting a song or a piece of music stuck on repeat in your mind. It can become upsetting when music is blaring in my head and I'm breaking down in sobs at the same time because it tends to be fucking happy music too, of all things. It's so obnoxious. Also, fun fact, neurodivergent people are way more likely to have perfect pitch. I also have hyposensitivities when it comes to proprioception, interoception, and pain. The physical, not emotional kind. Proprioception has to do with one's perception of the position of one's body parts. Interoception has to do with one's perception of one's internal organic processes, including things like feeling thirst, hunger, or the need to go to the toilet. I have a relatively high threshold for physical pain, I think. This probably derives from the poor interoception, which also makes it so that I can easily ignore thirst, hunger, fatigue, or the fact I need to pee, until I desperately need a drink, I get hunger cramps, or need to run to the bathroom because it feels like my bladder is about to burst. Hunger especially I can just completely ignore because I have next to zero appetite, both a consequence of the way I naturally am and depression. All of this can make self-care more difficult, and I forgot to add that being autistic can also make it more difficult to ask for help when you need it. Check. And it can make one's relationship to one's body looser, making what I'll call casual dissociation easier, or at least that has been my experience. I dissociate easily, mildly, but easily, especially when I find myself in overwhelming social situations. And to be more precise, by dissociating, I mean feeling disconnected from my environment and my body. My mind retreats inside of my body, so I'm no longer touching its edges, if that makes sense. Finally, beyond the hypo and hypersensitivities, autism often includes a need for sensory stimulation, and using specific sensory input when feeling overwhelmed can help one to calm down and center oneself back in one's body. This includes things like listening to ambient sounds in a headphone or ASMR, smelling something comforting, using weighted blankets, touching a particular texture, etc. I personally use nature sounds with a pair of headphones or wrap myself in a fleecy blanket blanket burrito when I need to chill. I also have a pillow I call my marshmallow that smells like sleep to me, which I find comforting and will rock with sometimes when I'm assailed by bad feelings. There is also seeking intense sensory input or stimulation for the sheer pleasure of it. Playing an intense piece on the piano will do that for me, or listening to a specific piece of instrumental music on high volume through headphones. It leads to what I like to call a soundgasm. I also really like roller coaster rides as a child, even though things like kart racing or driving, on the other hand, terrify me. Go figure. Emotional processing can also be different in and pose a challenge for autistic and more broadly neurodivergent people. About 50% of us have alexithymia, which is defined as a condition in which one has trouble identifying one's own or another's emotions and or communicating said emotions. From this can also result a struggle to regulate one's own emotional states, and combined with the unusual ways we experience empathy, issues with handling other people's emotional states. Note that alexithymia specifically can be found in other neuropsychiatric conditions such as depression. The first time I ever heard of it, I wasn't sure I had it actually. According to some people around me, including my parents or some of the therapists I've seen, I do have it to a certain degree. Once again, this is not an absolute condition, but something which can be more or less severe depending on the person. Also, like many other things, identifying emotions can become a developed skill for autistic people who will use their intellectual resources to compensate for something that should be more instinctual. That's why, as counterintuitive as it may seem, autistic people can make outstanding psychologists and be very skilled at introspection, or at least be very competent in certain specific social and emotional contexts, and handicapped in others. I've always considered myself an expert at knowing thyself, given all the alone time I've either enjoyed or suffered from, depending on the context. Over the years, that has allowed me to analyze my internal psychic processes. But maybe I'm not always as good at it as I think. Because yes, I've come to realize there are moments when I suck at identifying my emotions and suck even harder at communicating them in a way that makes sense. I feel very intensely, emotional hypersensitivity being another trait common in autistic folks, and feel many different things, and I know this, but I can't always put words to the feelings and can become easily overwhelmed by my emotions as well. I am good, even very good at times, at analyzing things at a calm, rational remove, but in practice and day-to-day interactions, I've had to acknowledge that I'm not actually that good at properly interpreting emotional context, especially when irritation or anger are involved. I'm very sensitive to negative emotional energy is what I'm going to call it, and can easily take it in even when it's not directed at me. An elevated tone of voice might simply imply excitement or passion. I know this rationally, but I'll often experience it as aggression or anger. I'm also extremely conflict averse, and the slightest hint of aggression sends my stress meters into high gear. And to be fair, this is probably also a result of trauma. This brings me to meltdowns and shutdowns. Both happen when one system becomes overloaded, either by external sensory stimuli or internal emotional stimuli, or both. I've experienced mostly the former. The latter more often translates to mild dissociation for me, as I've already touched upon in the previous section. I've also talked about my experience of anxiety and panic attacks in my previous video on mental illness, and meltdowns for me exist in the same general family of phenomena. Meltdowns happen for me because A, I'm not good at expressing difficult emotions in healthy ways when they should be expressed, because I suck at self-care, and B, I feel things very intensely, like I said, and all at once. So when the stuff I've kept pent up decides to surface and overload my nervous system, it's like I need to violently vomit emotions. Sorry for the image. I tremble, I sweat, I sob, I wail, I snot and drool, and noise rages inside my head. It's not pretty. I also often lose the ability to speak or speak coherently. Also, if you see someone you love in that state, ask them before you touch them. Touch is not always welcome in those situations, however well-intentioned and loving, even if the person in question is normally very affectionate with you. Finally, because of wonky emotional processing and emotional regulation, I honestly believe I don't have very little of what most people call gut instinct or intuition. It's like, there's this thing people tend to say about seeing a new doctor or therapist. Well, after the first appointment, you get a sense of what the person is like and how you feel about them, right? Well, no. not really. Or at least for me, it never goes beyond the either it felt god's awful or not too bad. Because all new encounters make me stressed to some level. And even if I feel somewhat at ease, I don't trust the feeling. But again, that's also because of trauma, to be fair. Now I'm going to talk about intimate relationships and physical intimacy, and to be clear here, I include friendships in the former. I've always felt extra weird and alone because of the way I conceptualize love and relationships. Add that to the pile, basically. Autism is often characterized by rigid or black and white thinking, which I touched upon in the rigidity section. For my part, I think I am pretty flexible and nuanced in my thinking and the way I approach ideas, concepts, etc. I'm also incredibly richly imaginative, though when I have an opinion, I have an opinion, if you know what I'm saying. But when it comes to feelings, experiencing attachment and love, I am indeed very black and white, all or nothing. I either love or I don't, basically. It isn't to say I don't experience some gray areas of affection, but I just don't deal with them well at all. They confuse me, make me uncomfortable to some degree, and generally leave me unsatisfied emotionally, and I feel terrible because of that. I've spent my fair share of hours also over the years trying to analyze and understand love, to classify it and make sense of the way I relate to it. I guess maybe it was kind of a special interest as well. And, this was also strongly promoted by the fact I was catapulted into a groomed and rape-based adult relationship as a very young teen, but more on that in the next video. It's a large part of the reason I was interested early on in monogamous relationships, polyamory, relationship anarchy, etc. Another special interest, I guess. Although I am actually probably very monogamous naturally, given my experience with David. I'll have to figure some of that shit out. Not that it even matters anymore. Deconstructing the standard monogamous life script allowed me basically to encounter ways of feeling and relating that were different from the norm, and I felt different from the norm. For instance, I don't really see romantic love as a discrete and clearly distinct category from what I call friendship love, and I feel like that's different from a lot of other people, but maybe I'm wrong. To me, a partner, ideally at least, will be a best friend with whom you share the entire spectrum of physical intimacy, which includes sexual intimacy. And depending on your life goals, will commit to a shared living space with and majority of your social time to. That kind of depends on people and their preferred arrangements, right? So yes, romance to me equals friendship love plus sex, to put it very simplistically. Which is why asexual but allo-romantic people, no offense, but make absolutely zero sense to me, because I have just no clue what they mean by experiencing romantic attraction if erotic bonding is out of the question. Where the rigidity also comes in is that I basically only conceive of 4 types of non-familial relationships. I perceive acquaintances, buddies, which most people would call friends, just perhaps not close friends, and friends, who to me are people you love, which can then further be divided into platonic friends and non-platonic friends, i.e. partners, lovers, boyfriends/girlfriends, whichever term you prefer. To me, a friend you can't say I love you to isn't a friend. I know, and have been told this by my therapist, that most people do conceive of multiple categories of friends, not all of which will involve actual love. But to me, that just doesn't really compute. And this buddy category I mentioned, which will involve gray areas of affection, is the one I struggle with the most. An added kicker is that I struggle a lot with purely platonic friendships or more casual bonds. IRL, this is easier online, obviously, given physical interactions are generally, off the table or very rare. If I become sufficiently emotionally and intellectually intimate with a person, shall we say, physical attraction will more likely than not ensue. And if that is blocked somehow, either because I just don't feel it to begin with, or, most notably because I know for a fact the other person will not have any interest, imagine I have a gay male friend, for example, my attachment then becomes blocked or stunted, basically. So, the Tumblr neurodivergent Mogai crowd has actually come up with a term for this. Not that I care too much about micro-identities, but coming across it made me feel a smidge less like an alien, so I'll throw it out there for you. It's called platonicism. To put it very simplistically, it basically means that I function better in and feel more fulfilled by fully partner relationships that include all forms of intimacy. David, my ex, whom I believe is on the spectrum like me, was actually the same. So we shared that together, however little it lasted. Whilst I believe this partly results from being neurodivergent, because you find a lot of this kind of perceiving and feeling of things in the neurodivergent community, it's also, simply a function of who I am as a person, and it might also have been reinforced by underage sexual abuse. The latter can affect patterns of attachment and one's relationship to sexual love, so I'm perfectly willing to acknowledge it might have contributed to my, lack of a less silly word, aplatonicism. But the fact is, I also just love very intensely because I feel very intensely, and I will throw myself heart, soul, and body when I truly connect with someone, which also makes me more vulnerable to abuse and makes breakups and loss even more exponentially painful. And this also tracks with autistic people's experiences of having a special person. Just as we have special interests, we can also have special persons who will often be our partners, and we will want to know absolutely everything about them. When I learned about this concept, it just clicked with me immediately because I've always functioned like that. When I'm in a relationship, I want to know everything about the other person. I become passionate about the other person because I care, because I'm interested, because I'm enthusiastic. Even their past relationship history, which I honestly think confused my exes a little, because it really didn't come from a place of insecurity or jealousy, but I think that's what they thought initially. The other person is potentially just a beautiful world to me I want to understand, just as I love cracking world building in my fiction. Then there is sex. I think there might be a stereotype that autistic people, autistic women especially, are all asexual or non-sexual by default. A stereotype which applies to other disabilities as well, I might add. And whilst there is an overrepresentation of sexual minorities, including asexuality, among the autistic population, we are not all, by any means, asexual. Some of us, in fact, are hypersexual and or have a high libido and great enthusiasm for sexual intimacy. Partly because, yes, it involves intense sensations and intense emotions. Part of the reason I enjoy sex so much, like I sometimes joke that the only classical vice I have is sex rather than, food or drugs, is because of the intense sensory stimulation it includes, but also because of the way it can connect me fully to my female body when I'm mildly dissociated most of the time, the way it alters consciousness for me. I just have a natural affinity for altered states of consciousness, and the intense levels of connection and love it channels between myself and my partner. It's all about this intensity and depth of feeling, though obviously this correlates with the quality and compatibility of the partner in question as well. But the same sensory input one gets from sex will be the reason why other autistic people have a hard time with sex without being asexual. It can be too intense for some, or intense in the wrong ways. Communication and emotional processing issues can also make it difficult, though once again, this also obviously correlates with the kind of partner one has. And for my part, whilst I love sex, or rather love making more precisely, and consider myself to have a high libido, I wouldn't ever see myself having it outside of a loving relationship, which does lead to a lot of frustration, of course, but that's just how it is. Also, speaking of sexual minorities, I might have mentioned this before in a couple of videos, but I am technically bisexual, practically speaking, experientially. However, I am straight in that I have only experienced being in intimate relationships with men, and thus have a hard time imagining myself in a couple with a woman. This is also because I've never really been close platonic friends with women either, so I have a hard time imagining being emotionally intimate with a woman. I have an easier time imagining being sexually intimate with a woman. But again, it all kind of loops back around to the issue I have with purely platonic relationships in the first place. So, as mentioned previously, my relationship to my body is what I would call loose. This is undoubtedly due to poor proprio and interoception, and this gives me the ability to mildly dissociate relatively easily. This makes self-care extra difficult at times, but has also had the side effect of making me not care that much about my appearance, which, you know what, I count as a bonus in a world where women, not only women, fine, but mostly women, tend to be very self-conscious about their appearance and will go to great lengths to appear beautiful, etc. I care about hygiene, yes, and I like to look decently good to myself, I guess, more or less, but anything that requires me being more than 10 minutes in the bathroom is not worth my investment. Which is partly why I've never worn makeup, for example. I also have a relatively healthy perception of my physical self, not that I ultimately think about it too much. Most of the time, I feel like a brain floating around in a meat suit with nimble hands, because I use my hands for a lot of things. This means that I get weirded out by my own videos at times. Yeah, that's a thing, and I kind of stare in wonderment at my voice issuing from my face. I am barely aware of my sexed body most of the time. Granted, I have small breasts and extremely chilled periods, so that probably helps. Nature has been kind to me that way. And conversely, I think this might contribute to feelings of bodily dysphoria and/or dysmorphia in other autistic people, girls especially, because trans-identifying people are also overrepresented in the autistic population. Speaking of gender and identity, while many women and men come to question the status quo and reject things like gender or race without being neurodivergent, of course, I'm not trying to claim we're better in this respect, it is typical for neurodivergent folks to struggle with social norms and social constructs, and this can give us a head start, if you will, when it comes to questioning and or rejecting traditional and or unfounded ways of doing and perceiving things. A lot of autistic folks, for example, are natural, more gender non-conforming, again, especially when it comes to girls and women. Not to give myself a medal by any means, but I didn't get why sexism, or racism I might add, was a thing from an early age. It just didn't make sense to me. Gendered imperatives always seemed weird and unfair, and I quickly rejected them. I've always considered myself a person first, a woman second, which once again has undoubtedly been helped by a looser connection to my sexed female body. I don't consider myself either feminine or masculine, though you are free to label me either or neither according to your idiosyncrasies. I don't much care. And I am only a woman because I am a female Homo sapiens. That's also why I'm gender critical, and being gender critical is what brought me to feminism as a teenager in the first place, though it wasn't even called that at the time. I only consider femaleness or maleness rather than femininity or masculinity, and femaleness to me only matters in the realms of health and sex, and appreciating my connection to the rest of the animal kingdom. I only feel sex euphoria, if you could call it that, during sexual activity. The rest of the time being female doesn't really register much, apart from, you know, the fact of living in an andro-capitalist society as a woman. Here's a nice little paragraph to summarize some of what I've just covered. Quote, along with general difficulty conforming to social norms, you have extra difficulty conforming to the narrow gender norms of being female. Your friendships can be more intense and uncertain than what people tend to expect, because connection is rare and difficult to maintain and exciting when it happens. It is hard to fit in with neurotypical girls, especially because of how much feminine gender roles play a part in socialization and popularity. It tends to be much easier to build connections online through specific interest groups and textual communication, or sometimes with boys. Yes, can confirm that fits perfectly with my experience. Finally, a quick note on masking. It's said that female autistics mask more than males on average, but I'm not sure if I've ever really masked much. I've never really sacrificed my true self in order to make friends, and have been alone in most of my life. I had what I call a psychic armor and developed social skills to cope with going to school, then uni, and both shattered during my 2020 breakdown. But I'm not sure a genuine autistic mask was included in either. I guess it doesn't ultimately matter all that much though. The end result was still that the things in question shattered, and that my system couldn't handle the fatigue, stress, and pressures of life any longer. On the other hand, staying true to myself, at least a big chunk of the time, means I have a strong sense of self, which I consider to be a resource. I do feel like multitasking can lead to a weakened sense of identity, reported by a lot of autistic people, which might also then explain why so many neurodivergent people seem to find comfort and cling to a variety of labels and micro-labels, for example. Also, awareness has grown that there is a male typical autistic phenotype and a female typical autistic phenotype. But a man can present more along the female phenotype, and a woman conversely can present more along the lines of the male phenotype. Autism is autism at the end of the day, to be clear, and it presents slightly differently in all individuals. For example, my ex David told me he related more to the female autistic profile, yet he definitely displayed traits that seem male typical to me, and I also think he probably masked more in his life than I did, which led to him having a more fragile sense of self than I do. Whereas I've related both to elements from traditionally male and traditionally female autistic profiles. It's a mix. Executive dysfunction is a disruption to the efficacy of executive functions, which are cognitive processes that are necessary for the cognitive control of behavior, such as attention control, inhibitory control, working memory, or cognitive flexibility. Executive dysfunction is very prominent in ADHD, autism, and comorbid psychiatric conditions such as depression, OCD, or PTSD, and it definitely loops back around to some of the stuff I covered in the rigidity section. For me, suffering from executive dysfunction means that while I have a good to very good long-term memory, kind of depends, and an excellent memory for music, however, my short-term memory is sometimes shockingly bad. My working memory is also affected by social interactions and communications. For example, I have a very hard time remembering instructions if I've been given them verbally. I work better with written instructions. My attention span is also pretty wonky and has gone down since my breakdown in 2020 to the point where I struggle to watch movies and TV shows now. That's just a thing I've observed, and it's kind of annoying. It also flags dramatically when I have to do something that bores the fuck out of me, hence the daydreaming and doodling I often did in Dutch class, for example. I thought it was a given that students struggled with subjects that didn't interest them, but apparently that's also kind of a specifically neurodivergent thing. I'm not entirely convinced, but I guess that means that on average, a neurotypical child or teenager will still manage to pay attention reasonably well to subjects they don't find particularly engaging. It can also be extra difficult for me to get started on a task, and once I get going, to stop doing that task. Being interrupted really pisses me off because it really takes me out of my zone, and I often struggle to get back into the flow of whatever I was doing. I am not good at multitasking and have always tended to get ridiculously stressed, and I mean really ridiculously stressed, or overwhelmed by the prospect of having to do multiple things in a day, especially multiple small tasks. I am an obsessive list maker as a result. Add to that my perfectionism and baseline fatigue, and you get someone who hates herself when she doesn't do all the things she thinks she's supposed to do. Some random traits which are common in autistic people and which apply to me as well. A tendency to draw patterns and connections between things whilst also being attentive to detail. Check. Remember what I said about my special interests web? My special interests are all interconnected and form a pattern that makes sense to me. I also draw patterns of meaning when it comes to understanding the world, human society, and the structures of oppression we've put in place. I mean, those patterns, to me, are valid and make perfect sense, but they aren't always easy to clearly explain to others. A heightened relationship to truth, justice, and fairness. Check. So I originally thought this was bullshit, actually. You know, just like a feel-good pseudo-superiority complex thing. But apparently this has been attested by research. I guess, given the head start autistic people can have when it comes to detecting societal bullshit, given our empathetic profiles, and given the fact a lot of us will have experienced discrimination in some form or another, makes sense. I guess it makes even more sense to me if one also factors in pattern making and a black and white thinking derived search for absolutes. Like I said, whilst I can be flexible in my theoretical thinking, I definitely seek absolutes as well, and the truth with a capital T derived from first principles in specific contexts. As an aside, this I think can also lead some autistic people to a strong relationship with faith, and perhaps non-traditional faiths in particular. I don't want to speculate too much though about this because I haven't investigated much, but for my part, the way I think and make sense of the world, which is tied into my neurodivergence because can't be any other way, has made it so that I do reject both traditional religions and materialist atheism. I have faith, but it is highly idiosyncratic. I mention this because it is a question on the Aspie quiz of all things, and I'm curious about this more generally, but I'm pretty shite at guessing people's age. I know prosopagnosia, so difficulty recognizing faces, is more common in the autistic population than it is in Gen Pop. And to be clear, I don't have that. But what about the ability to accurately gauge another person's age? Don't get me wrong, I can tell whether someone is a child or an adult, but beyond that? Probably doesn't help that I don't really know how old I feel most of the time, and the fact I had an asynchronous development, so where one's intellectual and emotional developments are out of sync with each other and one's peers, which is common in twice exceptional autistic people. I am also quite clumsy, and I've been told I'm hypermobile, at least in the upper body, by a GP and 2 separate physiotherapists. I know this and actual motor disorders can also be overrepresented in the neurodivergent community, which is why I mention it. Like, the number of bruises I get without knowing how I got them is kind of ridiculous, and once I managed to twist both of my ankles at the same time. True story. And finally, sleep issues are also common in autistic people. This is definitely my case. My sleep is not restorative. My REM sleep is unusually or abnormally active without being pathological, according to the one sleep lab I did 5 years ago. I dream intensely and vividly. I easily have lucid dreams or hypnagogic episodes. And then, there's the fatigue. Fatigue is often reported by autistic people. Fatigue from social interactions, whether positive or negative, actually. Once I spent a nice day with my ex-Philippe, but it was all day long, and when I came home I started crying, even though I wasn't actually depressed. It was just because I was drained. So yes, everything is quite tiring and draining because brain is always doing its things and doing its things wonkily. Being autistic often comes with physical and or psychiatric comorbidities, and it's also often comorbid with learning disabilities or ADHD. On the physiological front, I thankfully only suffer from IBS, which is besides more generally common in women suffering from mental illness, really, and I don't suffer from it too severely. For the record, I also have a heat allergy and atopic dermatitis, but I haven't checked to see if those are more common in neurodivergent people, but I wouldn't be that surprised if that's the case. And as to psychiatric comorbidities, well, I'll direct you to my previous video on the subject. Yes, depression and anxiety are much more common in the autistic population than in Gen Pop, and autistic people are more likely to die by suicide than allistic people. Depression and anxiety can also present differently and often need to be treated differently with an awareness of the patient's autism. Treatment-resistant depression, as a result, specifically might also be more common in autistic patients. And psychiatric misdiagnoses, such as bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder, are also common, quite common in autistic girls and women specifically who are diagnosed late in life. That or the psychiatric comorbidity will be correctly diagnosed, but the autism won't be. So one can, in fact, be autistic and suffer from bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or even a personality disorder. However squirrely that last category of DXs may be, it's pretty controversial more so than other diagnoses. As I've hopefully made it clear throughout the video, several autistic traits make it so that we are more vulnerable to abuse and subsequent trauma than Gen Pop. Which is of course not to minimize the suffering allistic people experience from those things. I hope that's obvious. I'm not trying to do an us versus them thing, not at all. But disabled women and girls generally are more likely to experience sexual abuse, and 2/3 of autistic females specifically, at least from some figures I've seen, will suffer from some form of sexual assault or abuse specifically in their lifetime. Difficulties with social communication and interaction, differences in emotional processing, intense attachments or love, and cognitive rigidity can all participate to make an autistic person particularly vulnerable to manipulative, abusive, and predatory individuals. Lived experience right here, but more on that in the next video. Those same traits and a hypersensitivity to stress can can also make it extra difficult for us to seek help and easier to acquire trauma, even develop a trauma disorder from our experiences. And there's this common saying now that there is no such thing as an untraumatized autistic person, because several different kinds of experiences, such as loss, grief, or bullying, can potentially be traumatically wounding. This bitch was a really long one, I'm aware. I'm not gonna apologize. If you're interested, you'll watch it. If you're not interested, you won't watch it, and that's that. But in any case, to those of you who made it through to the end, I hope this video was informative and enjoyable to whatever degree for you. I welcome questions and discussion down in the comments. Say hi if you are neurodivergent yourself, or not, up to you. And so next time, I will conclude my trilogy with a video about my experience with abuse and trauma. Then it'll be back to book content, I promise. So on that note, I hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourself. Thank you for the continued support, and I shall see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.